Hypersexuality is an excessive desire for sex that can cause serious impairment. We will be exploring how hypersexuality tests relationships, challenges identity, and can, with help, reveal life changing discoveries. This is Hypersexuality Stories. Hypersexuality. Hypersexuality may sound like a positive, having lots and lots of sex, or merely just a buzzword used in the media to describe anything from a pop star's provocative outfit or hypersexualized dance routines on TikTok. But for clinicians, families, people in treatment, and for individuals hearing their own personal diagnosis for the first time, hypersexuality is a highly nuanced, subjective, and perhaps most importantly, an extremely helpful label. Wikipedia defines hypersexuality as a term used for a presumed mental disorder causing people to engage in or think about sex to the point of distress or impairment. This podcast episode will explore whether there are differences between sex addiction and hypersexuality, how society shapes all of our expectations around sex, and the stories of people with hypersexuality speaking out to inspire change.
At least for me and for many people, it is all about ejaculation. Just for men, right? I can't speak to it about how it feels for women. I can only speak to it for how it feels to be a man with hypersexuality. I was ultra focused on ejaculation.
Gabe Howard, author and award-winning podcaster.
Women are not going to tolerate this. They're going to be like, well, I've got a selfish lover. There's all kinds of terms for this. You don't want to be that. Forget about hypersexuality. I'm just now going to give you a lesson on manhood, I guess. It's a weird space we're occupying right now.
Since 2018, the World Health Organization has formally recognized the diagnosis of compulsive sexual behavior disorder. But to define compulsive sexual behavior disorder and to find out who has it is intrinsically very hard. For example, in 2018, researchers at the University of Minnesota in America held a nationally representative sample of over 2,325 adults. They found 201 adults showed clinical distress and an inability to control their thoughts around sex. If you then scaled that up to the entire US population, over 300 million, that equals 8.6% of the whole population. As scientists still figure out how many people meet the still to be agreed upon criteria, individuals are the ones themselves speaking up about misconceptions.
A lot of people think that hypersexuality is having a lot of sex. And I want to clear that up right now. Having a high libido, wanting to have a lot of sex, having sex 5 times a day, that's not what hypersexuality is. You're allowed to have a lot of sex. You're encouraged, in fact, to have a lot of sex. I just, maybe not by society, but certainly by Gabe Howard, I think we should all be having as much sex as humanly possible. Where hypersexuality comes into play is when it's a compulsion, when you have to do it. If you don't do it, something bad will happen.
Gabe's hypersexuality is a part of his bipolar disorder, a serious mental health condition and mood disorder which can cause intense lows and highs, impacting the ability to function. Claire Dolman is a researcher at Bipolar UK and argues there is a substantial distinction between compulsive sexual behaviour disorder and hypersexuality for people with bipolar.
As somebody with bipolar 1 who's experienced this symptom myself of hypersexuality from when I was about 15, 16 till I was diagnosed when I was 23. And it caused quite a lot of problems in my personal life. And of course, I didn't know at the time what was going on.
Hypersexuality within bipolar would be defined as behaviour from a greatly increased sex drive causing impairment. And crucially, as a result of a bipolar mania or hypomania, both of which are episodic, meaning temporary in nature. This would mean hypersexuality for people with bipolar most often lasts for a matter of weeks or months. But this temporary hypersexuality can create devastating impacts and can also appear completely out of character to individuals and their families, further creating distress.
Looking back on that and realising that it was a big problem for people with bipolar, I looked at the evidence in the data in research journals, expecting to find some information about how this had been researched, and basically there's virtually nothing at all. There should be hundreds and hundreds of papers looking at different aspects of how this affects people with bipolar, just like how losing their job affects them, or what triggers affect them, or how many people are likely to commit suicide. All those aspects of having bipolar have quite a lot of evidence around them, but this has no evidence around it.
Mania is traditionally known to affect biomarkers such as increased energy, reduced to no sleep, reduced appetite, and often an increased sex drive. In the previously mentioned 2018 study of the wider compulsive sexual disorder, it was found that 7% of women and 10% of men said that they had significant levels of stress and dysfunction due to their sexual thoughts and behaviour. Claire offers another explanation to why there might be a gender gap in the self-reporting of hypersexuality.
I have some answers in my survey actually of men, saying, "Oh, it was great" and everything when he was like that. And so I think that might counterbalance the fact that generally men are less likely to, talk all that much about things. But on this particular subject, I think in a way they might be more willing to talk about it because some of them are actually quite proud about it, how they behaved.
Claire's comment reminds me of one of the main arguments against making hypersexuality a formal diagnosis. That because having a high sex drive and having sex outside of marriage has historically been stigmatised, some people might believe any sexual behaviour outside of their perceived norm must therefore have a pathological rationalisation. But for all genders, putting yourself in risky situations due to overpowering sexual urges might be why your hypersexuality becomes known as a problem in the first place.
You might transgress social boundaries a bit more. So you might flirt with your friends, flirt with your bosses, colleagues, go even further. And that, I think that's a risk taking coupled with the crossing of social boundaries. You probably, in the meantime, tested friendship, tested professional relationships, and then you look back and you're like, ooh, have I just done that?
That was Anne, who co-wrote a short film about her experience with bipolar disorder and hypersexuality. Anne argues that risk-taking is fundamental to understanding hypersexuality, and that due to society, this biologically driven compulsive behaviour has different consequences for women.
Well, risk-taking can take many forms as a woman, but one just being a bit more free in your movement, in what you allow yourself to say, in where you allow yourself to walk at night. Those can be very mundane experiences of taking risks for a woman, but can lead to violence being experienced.
The history of hypersexuality is also heavily rooted in gender and women's rights. Nymphomania, since the early 1800s, has been thought of as a medical condition characterised by a disturbing sexual drive, and was notably a woman's affliction. It was only in 1980 that nymphomania was removed from the American Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And though not explicitly named, hypersexual behaviour, including pornography and promiscuity, has been at the heart of feminist debate since the 1980s.
I am a feminist, and I definitely think my experience of hypersexuality has informed my feminist thinking and vice versa. I think also just having the feminist lens when looking at hypersexuality really helps you get rid of the shame and understand the societal expectations behind sexuality for a woman and a man.
Having a lot of sex may appear like society's ideal for men, but for Gabe Howard, the problem is that for all, the constant urges and compulsion lead to real and immediate anguish.
Hypersexuality is about when you're having sex, you're thinking about when you're going to have sex next. You're not even enjoying the sex that you're having because it's already entered your mind that you need to have sex again. It ruins sex. It makes it a compulsion, an addiction, something that you have to do, and it wrecks it. And I'm just, hypersexuality must have a great public relations team because whenever I bring it up anywhere, people are like, "Oh, that sounds awesome. You got to have a lot of sex." I'm like, no, I don't think about it that way. Think about it as wrecking something that would otherwise be incredible.
For Gabe, his first marriage broke down as a result of his cheating while hypersexual.
I convinced myself that it would be okay as long as I didn't get caught. Further convinced myself that since I was hiring sex workers, it was really okay because I wasn't dating. It wasn't love. It was transactional. I hired somebody. I got the sex I needed. They got paid. Everything was good. This was no threat to my marriage. It's not disrespectful to her. Right? These are the things that are going through my head. Even upon listening to them, a reasonable person would think, really? You thought it was okay to hire a sex worker behind your wife's back and you thought that was a kind, considerate thing to do?
Gabe, throughout his interview, takes full responsibility for his actions. Fully honest.
If you've got this pattern down for sex, I think the pattern wins. And I always used a condom when I had sex because I was terrified of becoming a parent.
Gabe's hypersexuality story is though he couldn't fix that relationship, he could fix himself.
One day, she finds out about it. She finds out about all of it. I can give her the lies that I've told myself. I can give her the logic that I've been telling myself, but she doesn't buy any of it because it was never true. It was a house of cards in my own brain that only I was dumb enough to fall for. She blew those cards down instantly with this piece of logic and this piece of logic. And I'm an intelligent person. I was like, oh yeah, that's a good point. Oh yeah, that's a good point.
Claire and Anne did a Bipolar UK webinar on hypersexuality this year, where viewers expressed that they needed support to discuss the issue of infidelity when hypersexual.
And I think maybe the most relevant practical advice was one of the questions on the Q&A, which was, how can you tell family members and loved ones about hypersexuality without it, quote, coming up as an excuse?
Yeah, it was a good question, and I think we need to put up some good information because then that would help people, and also including case studies, video case studies, people who are willing to talk about it, because it's so much easier if you can then tell a family member and say, look, would you watch this with me, because this person has the same thing as me and this has affected them and this is how it affects me. It's not just an excuse.
I can't think of any human on the planet that just, why would they not be hurt? You violated their trust and you hurt them. So I think this does another disservice to people who legitimately have hypersexuality, when even people who do have it, they're like, oh, I was diagnosed with hypersexuality, so it's okay that I cheated on you. It's okay that I lied to you. It's okay that I broke your trust. No, you heard the wrong message there.
Awareness alone does not solve the problem of hypersexuality. For Gabe, diagnosis was a key moment in his personal change. But he knows there are still so many people suffering in silence due to their belief that their damaging sexual behaviour is not a real problem.
Finally, when you are diagnosed with it, the next step is, what are you going to do about it? There seems to be this general idea of, oh, I have hypersexuality. Cool. No, what do you mean cool? Like, could you imagine, hey, you have cancer. Oh, cool. No, you're like upset. You want to solve the cancer, right? No, listen, hear me now. People who legitimately have hypersexuality, there's a sense of relief, because these are the people who are masturbating 15 times a day. These are the people who have rubbed themselves raw. These are the people who have lost jobs because they've left work so that they can go home and have sex or masturbate. These are the people who have hurt themselves and hurt others, and they have this long swath of sadness and self-hatred and anger in their wake. And the minute they hear this, all they can think about is, oh my God, you can do something to help me control these urges and feelings, so that two things can happen. One, I can stop hurting people. And two, I can start enjoying sex again.
This is Hypersexuality Stories. So far, we've heard how hypersexuality can be seen as a symptom of bipolar disorders, episodic, manic or hypermanic periods. Though we must be clear that not every person who has bipolar will have hypersexuality. We need to become more open and supportive of hypersexuality. So what is stopping us?
I think hypersexuality hasn't been talked about because we're too bloody prudent about sex. We're still not very good at talking about sex. Even now, where I've been, I think, relatively articulate about it, this is quite excruciating for me as someone who comes from like a British society and a Catholic upbringing. We either talk about sex in such an outrageous way, or we talk about it sort of in hushed whispers, embarrassed whispers, where I think we just have to talk about sex as a matter of fact.
Dan is a journalist, podcaster, and poet. He has type 2 bipolar disorder, and he has experienced hypersexuality since being a teenager. I met Dan in Peel Park and found out how intertwined his sexual identity, mental health, and hypersexuality story was.
Coming out as a bisexual man was almost easier than coming out as a bipolar man. Even though it took me a long, long time, the last person to figure out that I was bi or pansexual was myself. Everyone else had figured it out way before I had.
Anne is also bisexual, and she is against the unscientific stereotyping of bisexual people as being sex addicts or hypersexual.
Being bi, for example, there's this weird assumption that you're gonna sleep with a lot of people because you're bi, so therefore you're attracted to both men and women, and so that means you're suddenly non-monogamous. No, you can be monogamous and just be with one person at a time.
Claire, in an online survey this year, looked at how hypersexuality affects the lives of 1,500 people with bipolar in the UK.
I also had put self-disgust. I think it was about 40% said they felt self-disgust, which kind of at that time, perhaps, because they didn't usually behave in such a sort of outrageous way or whatever it was they were doing. And then I asked them a couple of questions later, how did they feel looking back on the episode when they were hypersexual? And then it had rocketed, the self-disgust had gone right up to 60%.
Even though hypersexuality is defined by it being an impairment, Claire is concerned that this high self-reported level of self-disgust is hurting recovery outcomes.
The fact that it was so high, self-disgust is quite a strong emotion, isn't it? It's not like just saying, did you feel a bit bad about yourself or something? I mean, self-disgust is quite powerful. I think for 60% to feel that, that's sort of about, in our survey, was well over 800 people, something roughly like that.
As well as romantic relationships, as Dan's story shows, an excessive desire for sex can get in the way of other important relationships.
I haven't cheated on anyone with it. I've not had sex with someone whilst I've been in relationships with it. But I do believe it probably has affected relationships, not just with boyfriends, girlfriends, but also with friends as well. The fact is, I've sat with friends when I've been hypersexual because it's been almost this flippant thing with them. And that's ruined the friendship because I've almost been dismissive with it because I've been in that frame of mind and slept with that friend, and clearly it meant more to them. And that's the consequences of that hypersexuality.
As well as impacting the people we already know, modern technology further enables hypersexual behaviour.
The fact is that with the hookup apps, that there's this high expectation of pure sex, and the etiquette goes out the window. And any sort of conversation is very much that primal thing about just having sex, just having a hookup. So the etiquette, the polite etiquette of considering someone's feelings or circumstances or situation, isn't necessarily part of that conversation. But that goes two ways. You're on the app for a very particular reason. You don't go onto Grindr to get married.
I don't think you should be worried. Again, I think it's just how you frame it. And if you are aware that hypersexuality can be a symptom, then everything changes. So from that point on, if you aren't aware though, then yes, potentially it can be a little bit more problematic just because you might not have full control.
When I met Dan, he was remarkably kind and considerate. Could hypersexuality be so overpowering that it could change a person's character?
You say I'm thoughtful, and I like to think that I am, but the impulse comes when you're feeling manic, and all the thoughtfulness just goes out the window when that happens. And everything is going at 200 miles per hour, and you're not getting time to breathe. You're not getting time to think about yourself. It's going so quick, and you're thinking, why isn't everyone else joining me? Why is everyone being so slow? Why aren't you all catching up? And because you're going at that sort of bliss, that sort of bam, 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 the consequences come afterwards.
Anne agrees that hypersexuality is overwhelming to personal experience. She argues that alongside tackling internalised shame, it is important, particularly for women, to prioritise practically their health and safety.
Okay, what are the practical steps for me that I can take to be a bit more safe? So my example is, if I knew I was gonna sometimes have hypersexual symptoms in a manic episode, then the way to protect myself from unwanted pregnancies was to wear a coil. And that's as simple as that. Like, it's something that then means that at any moment, there's no forgetting a pill or something like that. It was just there, and I knew I was protected in that way. I mean, 99%, but that's one practical step, and it's up to how everyone's comfortable with their body. But for me, that was really, it made me safe. It made me feel safe.
A man raped Anne while she was hypersexual and cheating on her partner, in her own words.
The first process to really talk about it is naming it. So it's not an incident, it's a rape, and it's fine to talk about it in those terms because that's what it was. And the thing to note is that rape isn't a symptom of hypersexuality, but it is a potential consequence of taking risk as a woman in society. That's different.
Anne made a short film called Trust Me, which includes the aftermath of when a man raped her. Anne found strength in sharing her story, because being made alongside her friend, it was crucially a safe space where she had full creative control of her own experience.
The question was, okay, how much do I say from my personal experience? Am I going to regret even bringing it up in the film? Because it is something such a taboo to talk about. But then again, that's like with anything with bipolar and the illnesses, the more you talk about it, the more it becomes normal. The more it starts to, you draw some distance from it, and I think that's really healthy. So I don't think everyone could or should talk about it. It's not something that is easy to talk about. It comes with time as well. I am really glad with the decision I took.
Claire began her hypersexuality study across all genders after a previous study focused on women with bipolar unearthed numerous emotional responses regarding distressing sexual hypersexual experiences. Though extremely upsetting, Claire's current research, which she is seeking to get published, is particularly groundbreaking because anonymous women with real, complicated, and often stigmatized stories are finally being heard.
There were several really awful stories in the written testimony. Sort of thing that recurred again and again was that they would go out to a bar or a club, being quite sort of open to trying to find somebody to go home and have sex with. They would go out of that social space either to the man's home or even just outside of the club, like in the street or something. They would then be frightened, and their fear would be stronger than this intense sexual drive, because they were then really frightened that they were there on their own with this man they didn't know. They wanted to go at that point, but then that was too late.
As well as confessional academic research, the conversation around hypersexuality is being led by thousands of anonymous posters, mainly on subreddits and YouTube comments. With all the daily threads asking, "Do I have hypersexuality?" or "How do I stop it?" the few named individuals sharing their stories are even more powerful and inspirational. Anne's hypersexuality story is that though she had something terrible happen to her, through knowing herself, she has learned that how she views herself, others, and sex is ultimately self-defined.
Understanding the shame and understanding how you can get rid of it. And there's a real freedom to knowing that you do recover from a rape, that you do recover from having lived what is often told to you as you grow up the worst possible thing that can happen to you. There's a real freedom to that, and a real, yes, I'm still here, and what? There's an empowerment.
Gabe advocates for Mental Health Weekly in his award-winning podcast, Inside Mental Health. Part of the reason why he educates others is because he himself needed mental health and sex education, growing up and as an adult.
I really wish that we had more robust sexual education, and I wish that we had more robust mental health education. The two of those topics, even in America in 2023, are still very much, And this is not a protective factor for people who are experiencing hypersexuality, having sexual issues, or having mental health issues. I believed very strongly that because I was a man, I needed to be able to regulate my own emotions. This was something that my dad taught me, right? He taught me that men are strong and men defend their families and they defend the women around them and they don't take no guff.
Gabe discusses the culture wars in the United States, where sex education is heavily politicised. But this shame around mental illness and sex is found all over the world, preventing people from discovering they have hypersexuality and so starting their journey of progress.
So when I first started feeling bad about sex, I just thought, well, society does a really good job of shaming people who like sex. So I just need to ignore these huge warning signs that something's going wrong because after all, it's just societal pressure. And this something was going wrong. I want to be very clear. I had hypersexuality. I needed help. I needed treatment. I needed understanding. I needed way more information, but I didn't even go out and look for it because I just assumed that the shame that I was feeling was the shame that society instilled in me from the time that I was born.
In Britain, Claire understands that all health professionals need greater awareness to empathise with patients when they do speak up.
When I asked them had they discussed it with the health professional, I think it was less than half had, and 60% said that no health professional had ever asked them about hypersexuality. It's not the kind of thing that you bring up necessarily without any encouragement. So I think that we really need to raise awareness mainly among psychiatrists and psychiatric nurses and people, working in sort of secondary care, that this is something that needs to be talked about more.
Dan is at a point of his hypersexual story where, gratefully, due to his knowledge of self and psychology, he can now finally see hypersexuality in a neutral light.
There is stigma about it. There's stigma about anything when it comes to mental health and sex. And the fact is you're combining mental health and sex with hypersexuality, therefore it's double stigma. And with this, when I say the knowledge is power, your perception of it is power as well. And the fact is you have a choice whether to feel ashamed of this or not. And if you look into it, acknowledge it and embrace it as well, that feeling of shame can go and you can enjoy the rough with the smooth.
Anne finds peace in her life outside her sexuality, from living on a canal boat, to her career, to her other relationships. And within this life she has created, she has found freedom.
It's just amazing how you leave with no trace, but you leave with everything you have. And that moment where you go away from your mooring spot and you look back and there's nothing there, that minimum footprint is really beautiful.
And Gabe's hypersexuality story is that through self-development, knowledge and compassion, he takes responsibility for the consequences of his past hypersexuality, with honesty, dignity, and without shame.
On one hand, I need to move on. I need to forgive myself, but I hope that I always feel a little bit of shame for what happened because it's a very, very huge protective factor to make sure that it never happens again.
The intersection between mental health and sex. Hypersexuality Stories.